morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is Josie Silver, whose novel One Night on the Island has just been published. Josie, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for asking me. It's great to be here.
So I've read a lot of fiction that's been set on islands recently, mysteries, literary fiction, romances. What makes an island a particularly good setting for a novel, and why did you want to set one there?
Okay. Well, I went for the island in this case purely because I think actually it's because I was writing it during the pandemic, and it gave me that, that feeling of we were all kind of under isolation and kind of, just, how can I put it? I think it was just, you're kind of closed in and you can't go anywhere. And the borders of the island, especially with this book, because it's such a small island, it kind of contains the story and it contains the people. Originally, I was going to set it on a Scottish island, so I did quite a lot of research about the islands up there. And then, funnily enough, someone else was writing a book that was based in a Scottish island, so my editor said, would you mind just moving it across, just a little bit? So all of that research went out the window, and I had to kind of start again with research in Irish islands, because obviously with the pandemic, I couldn't travel to do proper kind of on the ground research. So it was reliant a lot on the internet and on speaking to people and watching millions of YouTube videos, and to try and create, because I didn't want to place it in a real location, that was kind of bound by the geography of the island and the actual facts of it. So I'd sort of cherry picked lots of bits of different islands that kind of suited the story to create one island that fit exactly the needs of the story.
I think the only disadvantage for the reader of it being a fictional island is that we're all going to want to go there.
Do you know, I've had so many people already write to me and say, where is this island? And if it was real, I would be there. Yeah. I think I've kind of created my perfect getaway.
Your biography describes you as, and I'm quoting here, an unabashed romantic who met her husband when she stepped on his foot on his 21st birthday. Now, let's set that story aside for just a second, although I'm sure it's a good one. But how does being a romantic shape your approach to writing a novel?
Well, first of all, I'm going to confess something, because that story has followed me through my entire writing career. And the genuine truth about that story is that my editor needed a snippet of information to write in the biography, and she couldn't get me, so she made it up. So I did not step on my husband's foot, much as I would love to say. And I've tried to kind of gloss over that one and say, but I think in truth, I met him, it was a work romance, it wasn't that kind of, exciting and meet cute as much as it would be lovely if it had been. So yes, let's set that story aside, because it's not actually true. But I am a massive romance fan, whether it's on the screen, I love all the classic kind of romantic movies, whether they're the old ones or the new ones. And I've only ever read romance. Well, no, that's not true. I read all sorts of books, but romance is always the kind of genre that I go back to. Even from being a child, really, with going with my gran and seeing her piles of Mills and Boon, that was my original plan when I was about 14, was to try and write Mills and Boon. And I've still got, actually, I'd show you if I could put my hands on it, an old cassette that I sent for, because they used to do a writing guide at Mills and Boon. So when I was about 13, 14, I sent away for this guide, and they sent me a pamphlet of how to write romance and this little cassette. So I think it's always been just kind of my safe place, whether it's on film or whether it's on paper.
So let's talk about your heroine, Cleo, for a minute. She's about to turn 30. And for
Yeah.
her, that's just this massively big deal. And I have to say, as a reader who is a lot older than that, I look at her and I was like, oh, honey, just wait, but on the other hand, it's fascinating to me how you are able to talk a little bit about how you're able to establish her character by kind of having this narrow, focused point of view, almost having these sort of blinders on about the big bad world, if you were. What does that help you do in terms of creating her character?
Cleo is she's a girl who's kind of grown up as the coddled baby of her family, and with these big dreams of being a writer. And she went to London, and she lost her dad very young. She didn't know her dad, actually. He died when she was a baby. So she's grown up with this kind of perfect romance that her parents had as the backdrop of how she sees love should be. And she's got this unrealistic opinion, I guess, of how romance should look, because she's never actually seen it, because her parents had this wonderful marriage that finished, really early. And her mom's never remarried. So she's had this kind of impression of true romance and true love being this magical thing that she's never really witnessed, but that she's searching for. And then she falls into this life of being a columnist, where she's constantly sort of the dating columnist. So she's constantly throwing herself into this idea of a new romance and trying out, different dates, and it's never working out for her, because I think she's probably got unrealistic expectations of what she's looking for, and she doesn't really know, what it is that she's searching for. She's got this yearning for something, but she doesn't know what it is. And I think going away to the island gives her that moment to pause and to just think, well, without all of that stuff that's going on around me and the life that I've built that I thought was the life that I needed, what is it that I really want? So the book kind of opens with her in that dilemma position of just about to turn 30 and throwing everything up in the air to see which bits of her life she really, really wants to keep.
Yeah. I guess anybody who's read very many romances or even seen a romantic film will know that the genre relies very much on these tropes. You mentioned the meet cute was a trope that we all sort of understand, and it's a really sort of rich part of the genre. But I like the way you take those tropes and you use some of them, but then you subvert others. Can you talk a little bit about that, about sort of how you see the relationship of your work to these tropes, and how you use them as tools, but then also kind of turn them back on themselves sometimes?
That's actually really interesting, because that's how I've always started with my books, is to take a trope and then think, well, what can I do with that that's going to kind of freshen it up and make it different? Or so with my first book, One Day in December, the trope was love at first sight. Mm-hmm. Which happens on page 1, so it's no spoiler. And then it's kind of how to kind of play with that to make it feel fresh, I guess, because romance is one of those, as a genre, I think people come to romance because they know that, or they can expect either a happy ever after ending, or they can expect at least a hopeful, happy for now kind of ending. And really, I think the joy of writing romance is finding a way to get to that point that isn't predictable. So people expect these, these tropes to be there, and look for them and enjoy them, and will buy based on the fact that that trope is there. But I think everyone likes to see just something a little bit different put into it to make it feel like a different story, even though you've read similar versions of, well, there are no new stories, are there? It's just new ways to tell them. So I'm always looking for that, to try and include them, but just change them up a little bit, just so as the journey towards that safe, happy ending is unexpected and feels realistic.
Yeah. One of the tropes, and you kind of mentioned this briefly already, one of the tropes in romance is a heroine who's being misled or giving false expectations by the tropes of romance. To what extent, if any, do you see this book as sort of, or parts of it as being almost metafictional, sort of commenting backwards on the romance genre?
Yeah, I mean, she's very aware, I think, of that aspect of her life, because she kind of lives this trope, if you like, because she's this, it's quite a well-trod path within the romance community, that she's a journalist, and she's been a dating columnist. So she's very aware, I think, of her own position as a heroine in her own story, if you like. Yeah. And I think when she gets to the island and she finds Mac, incumbent in the lodge, again, it's very much kind of romantic movie stuff, isn't it? But it's very different, really, trying to find a way to make that feel less like something that's just done for effect, and more realistic.
Yeah. So you mentioned Mac, and some of your chapters are told from the point of view of Cleo, who we've been talking about, who lives in London and has come to this island off the coast of Ireland. But others are told from the point of view of Mac, who is an American photographer who's been double booked in this pretty isolated cottage where they're staying. They both seem like nice, reasonable people when we first meet them, and yet they can't seem to find a way to be nice and reasonable around one another. Can you talk about how the juxtaposition of two different characters allows you to sort of reveal more about them by sort of showing them from a different angle?
Yeah, I think they are actually quite opposite in where they are in their life. They're quite similar as people, but the position that they found themselves in at that point of their lives is very different. So she's been looking for love, and he's trying to hang on to love. So they're opposite ends of their love stories, really, which makes her hopeful and him jaded, I think, when it comes to romance. So they're automatically at opposite ends of the spectrum. And they are nice people, they're both good people, and which is something I always try to do with my books, is kind of have no sugary kind of sweet people, no villains, no heroes. They're all normal people who sometimes they do amazing things, sometimes they make terrible mistakes, and it's more realistic, I think.
So I like the way that the novel is structured. We can sort of back and forth between these 2 points of view, but also talk about how you use these sort of subtitles at the beginning of each chapter head. This is something I did in my novel, Escaping Dreamland, and it was so much fun to come up with them. Tell us, how did you come up with these subtitles, and how did you use them to sort of guide both the reader and the structure of the novel?
Yeah, each of the subtitles is actually a line lifted from that particular chapter. So it was going through the chapter, really, and identifying what's the main bit of that chapter, what's the point of it, or where's the humor sometimes, because as well as romance, it's kind of romantic comedy. So it's finding the point of humor that's going to kind of, when you read that title, make you want to go through and continue to read that chapter.
Yeah. Cleo talks about the difference between her flat that she lives in London and Otter Lodge, this very remote cabin on the island, and she calls it the difference between Jupiter and Mars. How do you reveal her character? What do we find out about her because of the fact that she's been, if you will, sort of taken out of her native environment?
Yeah, I think she's quite lost when she's in London. I think she's surrounded by so much noise and so much, her work is busy and her life is busy, and there's so many people, it's quite transient. So she's allowed herself to get buried beneath that, and being taken out of that and put in a place that's so absolutely opposite. I think that gives her as a character the chance to grow and the chance to stop and to see, what's missing.
And from the point of view of the reader, I mean, this is a trope we've seen before, the sort of fish out of water. But again, to me, it seems like you kind of handle it in a different way, because when she does start to enter the community, it almost feels like she fits in better there than she fits in London. It doesn't feel like a fish out of water. Again, you're kind of subverting the trope. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
I think she expected to feel like a fish out of water. I mean, she's gone there without the intention of being part of the community at all. So it comes as a surprise to her. I think she probably got stereotypical ideas of the kind of people that she might find there, and she's very surprised by the breadth of people that she finds, and the warmth, and the fact that she does actually feel as if she fits in. I think in London, she's desperately wanted to fit in and to feel that she's found that the thing that she thought she wanted is the thing that she wanted. But I think stepping away, she's realised that perhaps something completely different, even though it isn't what she wants, is what she needs.
Yeah.
And that community, those people are so diverse and so unexpected. And I think the way they welcome her in just kind of makes her feel that there are other options and that there are other paths that she can take that might be more fulfilling than the one she's already chosen.
Cleo sees Mac as, she says, he has the innate, assured articulation every American seems to be born with. And she sees herself as this sort of very, buttoned up Brit. How do their cultural backgrounds come to bear in this strange relationship between the two of them?
I mean, he is very easygoing. He's very American. He's from Boston, so he's all about Red Sox and lobster rolls and Springsteen. He is very, very much larger than life and very confident. And like most Americans, I think that's probably me coming through on the page. I think of most Americans as very articulate and fabulous teeth, and so it's very very different to Cleo. She's very, I think he comes across as opposite to her in her eyes, because she's so unsettled and unsure of where she's going, and he appears to be the opposite. He knows exactly what he wants, even though he hasn't got what he wants at the moment. He does know exactly what he wants, or what he thinks he wants.
Yeah. So what was talk to us about the challenge of writing an American character. I mean, most of us have probably written a character who lives in another country than we do, but especially when you were, locked down and you couldn't come to Boston. What was it like to try to get the voice of Mac?
Well, I've never been to Boston, so that was a challenge. So again, relying on resources like the internet and books and people, but I'm also extremely fortunate to have an American editor who went through it with a fine tooth comb and worked really closely with me to ensure that all of the geographical details are right, and the kind of the nuances of his speech, and the chapters that are written in, as you said, it alternates between Mac and Cleo. And Mac's chapters are written in American English, and they are written in his voice, obviously, with everything that would normally be said. The differences between the two, between American and English, American English and English. Just the nuances of difference between the way things are spelt and the way things are said. So we've tried to differentiate between them, subtly all the way through, to make sure that he is very much an American man and she's obviously very British.
And how does that cultural difference sort of get in the way of their being able to understand each other?
I think they're fine. They're kind of medium in the middle. She introduces him to some of her Britishisms, to do with cooking and those kind of things. But they have this thing that they do at the end of each evening where they share 3 secrets. Some of them are mundane, some of them are quite deep. And I think that's kind of how they cross the cultural divide between them, by sharing, the things that they wouldn't necessarily normally share with someone that they don't know very well.
You read about the smell and the sound of London. I mean, I spent a lot of time in London, so it grabbed me immediately, and about how that contrasts with the sort of sensory world that she's in on Salvation Island. how as a writer do you capture those sensory sensory impressions of a place and then sort of use them to act on the reader?
I think the island itself, in One Night on the Island, Salvation Island, is almost a character
Mm,
separately from Cleo and Mac. It has this, as you say, the scent of it is this peaty kind of salty coldness to it, and it it kind of spoke to me, I think, as the island, as a place that, creating it, I feel as if I've walked the perimeter of that place 100 times round with Mac, because he's a photographer, so I've kind of walked with him all around the edge and, been on that journey. And there's a hill, Wailing Hill, which is just outside the lodge where they are, which has got a boulder on the top, which is where they sit, which is the only point for connection for, their phones to connect to the internet and that kind of stuff. So creating the island felt like creating, I don't know, kind of a sanctuary, I guess.
mhm.
So remind me what the question was, sorry.
Well, we were talking about the sensory writing, and but I think you got right on it too. And to just sort of build on that idea of there's this one place on the island where they can connect on their cell phones. It strikes
Yeah.
me, I've run into this problem. Sometimes I end up setting books a while back because of this problem, that if you're writing about isolation, about mystery, about a lot of things, it's a different ball game when your character has something in their pocket that can answer all their questions and give them all the secret information and so on and so forth. So what do you accomplish narratively by then putting them in a place where they don't have that 24/7 connection to the outside world?
I think it was very necessary, actually, that they didn't have that connection.
Mhm.
To begin with, I did have it that they did have the connection, and taking it away made it so much richer and made the connection between them so much stronger, because that was all they'd got was, each other. Whereas if you've got, access to all of your normal trappings of your normal life, it's difficult to kind of be completely separate and away from it. So I think it's essential to the story that they don't have easy access, which for Mac in particular, because he's a father and he's got two young boys, that really does add to his frustration and his angst,
Yeah.
which, I mean, as a parent, I'm a parent of boys about this, well, a little bit, my boys are a bit older, but being away from your children is, so difficult for anyone, but for him in particular, in the position he's in and at the point of his life that he's in, being in touch with his kids and being a good dad is the kind of the touchstone of his life. So not having that easy access certainly increases the tension for him.
It also sort of plays into this whole idea that although Cleo ostensibly is there for professional reasons, and Mac too, but she also says that she's on a break from her life in London. She's sort of having this hiatus that sometimes we all wish we could have. Is a little bit different than the one that was forced upon us in 2020. But how does this notion of sort of being on hiatus from her normal life play into the narrative of how Cleo spends her time on the island?
Yeah, I mean, she's very stressed about the big birthday that's approaching, and I think the relationship that she has with her boss is quite, her boss kind of understands more about what Cleo needs than Cleo does, I think, at the point when she sends her away. And going away and being on hiatus from everything that she knows is really kind of what she needs at that point in her life. She, I think she's kind of reached breaking point without realizing it, which, I think, and the pandemic certainly affected the way that I wrote the story and the, the experience of isolation. So yeah, I think she needed to get away and she needed to be able to stop and to think about, how she built the life that she's built in London, and whether it's serving her and whether it's, she learns so much about herself while she's there, particularly about things like friendship, and that sometimes the friendships that we've got in our life aren't meant to be forever, and that's, I think, one of the big lessons that she learns.
Yeah, it gives her, it's interesting how she reflects back on her life in London from the island, and it gives her sort of a perspective that she doesn't have when she's in the middle of it. I also find that, to me, I felt like there were these sort of multiple layers of irony in Cleo's situation. So she writes this column about trying to find somebody, trying to find love, but she can't. So she goes on a trip to be alone. But she can't be alone because she found somebody. So it's sort of built on itself. Talk about
I think the irony is lost on her that done all this way to be alone and ends up, in a situation that would be perfect fodder for a column.
Yeah. So talk about the pull between her desire for isolation and her desire for connection, and how those two kind of sort of pull against each other.
I don't think, actually, when she was originally, because it wasn't her choice to go to the island in the first place, it was her boss's idea. So she was quite resentful, I think, about the idea of going and being alone, and didn't really want that experience. But then by the time she got there, she'd sort of come around to it and found, she was ready for it. And then obviously when she gets there, she finds a community, and she finds Mac, and she finds all of the things she doesn't think that she's going there for. But actually, those are the things that keep her there, and those are the things that make the sabbatical that she takes there so absolutely life-changing.
Mm-hmm. And if we sort of back up our focus from that idea of the conflict between isolation and desire, are you really writing about how we all struggle to balance the internal and external lives that we have?
Oh gosh, I mean, absolutely. I think everybody is definitely on that battle, aren't they, between, the things that surround you and the things that you do out of duty and because of family and because of responsibility, compared to the things that you would really desire to do if you had the chance to stop and make different choices. And I think that's one of the appealing things about the book as a reader, is that we'd all kind of like to step off all of our usual responsibilities for a little while and have the chance to just be, without the responsibility for anyone else and without our usual, ties. So I think as a reader, this kind of book kind of gives you the chance to do something while still sitting at your own kitchen table rather than actually doing it yourself.
Yeah. And what, for you as a writer, what is that balance between the inner life and the outer life like? Because, I mean, writers, our occupation sort of requires us to spend more time on the inner than some other occupations do. So how do you balance those two things in your life?
I mean, I'm quite a home bird anyway, so I'm quite lucky. I'm not, I work from home. I've had a studio put at the bottom of the garden, and it's my sanctuary. So, this is, for me, it's the perfect life, because I'm quite content with my own company quite a lot of the time anyway. So, and then there's the occasional times when you get called away to London or do something exciting. And I think that little bit of, razzle dazzle is lovely. But I'm more of a stay at home in my PJs. My happiest days are when I'm kind of, in the office, cup of tea, writing. It's my dream job, really.
So then, you talked a little bit about how COVID and the lockdown sort of played into not only how you research the novel, but really the novel itself, these sort of themes of isolation. And it really almost feels like, especially at the beginning, it feels like these characters are in lockdown. I mean, there's a storm, they can't leave the cabin, but did that make a big change in your life when that happened? Or as a writer who works at home anyhow, is it sort of business as usual?
It made a big change in that my kids were home. I've got teenage sons, so they were home, and I didn't expect them to need all that much help with the teaching side of things, but it turned out that they do need someone behind them all the time. So I kind of became part-time teacher, along with Alexa, who became my new best friend because she knows everything and I know nothing. She was the teaching assistant in the classroom. And obviously, there's the whole, that feeling of uncertainty and anxiety that came with it, particularly with early lockdown. I found it really difficult to work, for my brain to be settled enough, mentally to be calm enough to work. So I did find real upheaval. I started to, before I actually wrote this book, I started a different book. And I did perhaps 20,000 words and got to a point where I hated it. My editor hated it. And we both kind of said, this isn't working. And it was purely because I wasn't in the right mental headspace to be writing. And it was coming out really quite hard work. And I think it would have been hard work to read. So we put that on the back burner and went for something particularly more upbeat. That was the idea of this book, really, was that, that it's purposefully escapist, and it's purposefully doesn't mention the pandemic at all, even though, the pandemic probably shaped it because the whole, lockdown situation is there on the page. But the pandemic isn't mentioned at all. And it's not dated because I think once the pandemic, if the pandemic is ever over, the last thing anyone's going to want to read about is the pandemic. Yeah. So, it's kept purposefully off the page whilst kind of being on there.
Yeah, the other thing I noticed in the book, I think for a lot of us, the pandemic sort of changed our ideas of what home is and what home means, because you're spending so much more time there. And Mac, at one point, he has in a deteriorating marriage, he lives separately from his wife in a condo, and he says no place feels like home right now.
Yeah.
How does the idea of home and what it is and isn't shape these two characters and their relationship to the island?
Well, Mac is when Mac first arrives on the island, he is kind of running away from home, if you like, because his home, everything that he thinks makes home, has been taken away from him. So he's separated from his wife, and he doesn't live with his children. And he has connections to Salvation Island through his family, through his ancestors. So he's looking, I think, for connection because he's lost his connection in Boston. He's looking for a new connection. So I think going to the island for Mac is looking for home. Whereas for Cleo, I don't think it is at all. She's kind of been running away from home ever since she left her family home. She was happy there. She's got a lovely family, but I think she's never felt quite as if she's found her place. And she didn't expect the island to be her place. So I think it completely blindsides her when she gets there and finds this place that speaks to her heart and feels, for the first time for her, like home.
And one of the parts of that is this beautifully captured sense of community that I suppose in some ways is unavoidable in a place, an isolated island. I mean, if you couldn't get along with the people who lived there, you probably would just leave. Tell us a little bit about how you went about creating that community, because as you said, you couldn't travel, you couldn't go sit on an island and watch how people act with one another, and yet you created these great local characters. Talk a little bit about that process.
Okay, I absolutely love the secondary characters. Any book that I write, the secondary characters for me, I love them more than the main characters. There's fun and there's so much more scope. And I think I was conscious that I just wanted there to be a lot of variety amongst them. So you've got, as you said, it's a really small, rural, isolated community. So there's a wide age range, and there's a wide variety of characters. And I think it needs that. I think, not making them predictable is kind of what makes them interesting. So you've got, a lovely group of ladies, the knitting group.
Yeah.
And they're not predictable at all. That Cleo expects them to be a certain kind of way, and they turn out to be colourful and funny and acerbic. And I think that's what it needs, is a mix of, again, no heroes, no villains, but some of them are quite testy.
Sure.
And I absolutely love writing them. The more testy they are, the better. So, I love Delta, who is Cleo's friend on the island. But Delta's mother I love even more, because she's so straight-laced and so difficult, but so I think you have to kind of make them lovable as well. So I think the pub on the island is probably the hub of the island.
Yeah.
And the guy that runs the pub, in my head, he's Bill Nye. I always kind of cast people in my head of who they are.
He'd be perfect. Yeah.
Movie. So he's my fantasy Raf, who kind of is the father of the island, if you like.
Yeah.
So secondary characters, absolutely love them.
Cleo, another thing that I find sort of almost metafictional about this is that Cleo's supposed to be on this journey of self-isolation. She's supposed to be going there to be alone, to sort of connect with herself. But she's writing a column about it. And she discovers that this column is now more popular than ever, that she's bringing along with her on this journey in a very real way, these thousands or tens of thousands of readers. How does that knowledge that her isolation is this widely shared isolation affect the way that she decides what to do and lives her life? How does her writing affect her real life?
I think that's where she's very fortunate that the internet connection is so bad, because it doesn't really have a massive effect on her and the way that she lives on the island, because it's not touching her life. She's not constantly able to check her phone when she's in the loo and do all of the things that people do in their normal lives. She's very, very cut off. So besides being able to file the column, she's really not staying on top of all of the social media side of things, which is such a big part of her normal life. And it's very fortunate, I think, that she doesn't have it there.
You talked about the guy, Bill Nye, who runs the pub, as being the father of the island. I think I love that image of him as the father of the island, because as we kind of delve further into the psyches of Cleo and Mac, we discover that the concept of fatherhood is really important in this novel. Both Cleo having lost her father and Mac feeling the tensions of how he can be a father in a separated household. Talk a little bit about this idea of fatherhood, and did your own experience of fatherhood, even in your family as a child or in your family as a mother, affect the way you sort of created that idea in the novel?
Okay. I mean, I'm really fortunate. I've got kind of the best dad in the world. So that's where I come at it from with regards to fatherhood. So Cleo not ever having had her dad, to me, is so poignant, and I can kind of, feel that from her at every level. And Mac grew up with a dad who was quite feckless and, didn't stick around and made his life really difficult. So he's on a journey to be the best dad that he can possibly be and be the absolute opposite of his own dad. So they've both got quite big issues around either their own dad or Mac's, view of himself as a father is the most important thing to him, even more so than his position as a husband or as a son. His position as a father and making sure that his sons don't experience what he experienced as a child is kind of fundamental to who he is.
Well, you mentioned before, and I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask this question, considering that you already mentioned it and that it's such a big part of the novel. But you talked about how Cleo and Mac tell each other 3 things from their past every night before they go to bed. So some of them are, as you said, quite average, ordinary, no big secrets. Others of them are from the deepest parts of their soul. So what are 3 things you would like to tell us
Oh my God.
about Josie Silver before we
Well,
finish up the
I did not stand on my husband's foot. There's one. Oh gosh, what else would I like to tell you? There's things. I wish I could exercise more. I think that's one that's on my New Year's resolution list. And what else can I tell you? I'm kind of secretly hoping to script write in the new year.
Oh, good.
There you go. That's a secret.
Well, we like to end every episode of Inside the Writer Studio with the same 10 questions. You should be able to answer each of them in just a few words, but hopefully they'll give our listeners some insight into you and into your writing. So if you're ready, we will begin.
Okay.
What word do you love to work into your writing?
Now, I often use the word, and I have to go through my books and make sure I haven't used it more than twice in any book because it's so unusual. I often use the word melancholy because I love it. I think just the sound of it, it's so, lyrical, but it's quite an unusual word. So I try and keep it to a minimum.
What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Oh gosh, like word shortening. So like bicky or chocky or anything like that make me go a bit furious.
Where's your favorite place to write?
Oh, definitely my office. Yeah, I had the office in the garden put in and it's my sanctuary.
Where could you never write?
In a busy place. I can't write in cafes or much as I'd like to. I always think it looks very glamorous, but I have to be on my own.
To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
Grammar, okay. Probably, the Oxford comma or serial comma, I think you call it. Yeah, I'm a big user, big fan.
Yeah. What's the first book you remember reading?
As a child, I was an Enid Blyton fan. Famous Five, or my absolute favorite was called The Naughtiest Girl in the School.
Oh, that was our daughter's favorite too.
It probably says more about me as a child than anything else.
What are you reading now?
What am I reading now? I'm reading an early copy of Emily Henry's next book, which is called Book Lovers.
What book would you like to have written?
Gosh, I've recently read, and it's coming out in March, a book called Impossible by an author called Sarah Lotz. And it landed on my desk, and the cover was interesting. It got a lightning bolt. And I just thought, well, I'll just read the first couple of pages, and just sat back in my chair and just kept going because it just was absolutely my cup of tea.
What sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
Well, I don't think I could write anything too dark or too twisty. The plotting, I think, would be my downfall. I love to read them, but I'm not sure I could ever actually do one.
And finally, what would you like to hear a reader tell you?
I had a reader say to me that reading my book had made her bad day better.
Oh.
And that is just the nicest thing you can hear, isn't it? That's kind of why you do it.
This has been Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and my guest today has been Josie Silver, whose novel One Night on the Island is available wherever books are sold. Josie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. In our next episode, I'll be talking to Ruta Sepetys about her new novel, I Must Betray You. Until then, thanks for listening, and may you read with wonder and write with passion.